Thank you all. Well, before I begin, I am kind of curious to know how many of you are visiting Colorado for the first time? Wow, really? How many of you, this is your first time in the American West? I mean by that, west of Kansas City. Wow, really? I think I'm the only speaker at the event who resides in the American West. Southern California doesn't count. I was born in LA. I know that's not the West. So on behalf of the West, welcome. And you'll see the relevance as I go on. For those of you who have read Atlas Shrugged know that the first time that the word Atlantis is mentioned is in chapter 6, when Dagny Taggart is at a cocktail party and she overhears someone utter the book's catchphrase, "Who is John Galt?" And she turns to walk away, and she's stopped by one of the guests, an unnamed woman who says in a conspiratorial tone, "I know who is John Galt." "Who?" Dagny asks. "I knew a man who knew John Galt in person," the woman answers. "This man is an old friend of a great aunt of mine." "Do you know the legend of Atlantis, Miss Taggart?" "Vaguely," Dagny replies. "The Isles of the Blessed," the woman says. That is what the Greeks called it. They said Atlantis was a place that only the spirits of heroes could enter because they carried the secret of life within them. A radiant island in the Western Ocean. Perhaps they were thinking of America. The woman explains that John Galt actually found Atlantis, and Dagny loses interest, thinking the woman must be crazy. Whereupon the woman becomes belligerent. "My friend saw it with his own eyes," she says. "You don't have to believe it." When Francisco d'Anconia interrupts them, the woman brusquely walks away. Now, this incident is so brief that it's easy to miss the fact that this brusque and belligerent woman who knew about Atlantis was actually a real person, just as Ayn Rand famously included herself in a cameo in the novel as the character of the fishwife. So the woman at the cocktail party is a cameo of a real person, a woman who helped inspire Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's one-time friend and mentor, Isabel Paterson. In 1943, Rand, Paterson, and a third writer, Rose Wilder Lane, published books that helped jumpstart the libertarian or free market conservative movement. These terms are contentious, but they're good enough for our purposes. These were The Fountainhead, The Discovery of Freedom by Rose Wilder Lane, and The God of the Machine by Isabel Paterson. And at the time, both Rand and Lane acknowledged Paterson as their teacher and intellectual leader. And although she's largely forgotten today, Paterson was then one of the country's most important literary intellectuals, a pioneering journalist, novelist, and scholar, and the woman who gave Ayn Rand the image of America as Atlantis. Paterson was born on an island on the Canadian side of Lake Huron in 1886. She was named Mary Isabel Bowler. Her family was poor, and she had only a year or two of formal schooling, which ended when she was 11. Little is known about her early life except that her family moved to Michigan and then Utah and then to the Northwest Territories of Canada. In other words, she was a product of the American West, and she grew up witnessing in person Indian ceremonies, living in log houses, seeing covered wagons on the plains, and watching as railroads stretched across the frontier. She saw her first light bulb at the age of 16. She said she was too afraid to touch it, so she left it on all night. A year later, the Wright brothers took their first flight at Kitty Hawk. In 1910, she married a man named Kenneth Paterson, but the marriage only lasted a few weeks before the two separated. Despite their breakup, they never officially divorced, and Paterson kept his name. Months after the marriage failed, she moved to Spokane in Washington, where she got a job writing editorials and short stories for a newspaper. And she signed that column IMP, for Isabel Mary Paterson. She would make these initials famous, but her closest friends called her Pat. In 1912, she moved to New York, where she worked as a journalist and a novelist. On one occasion, she rode along with the pioneer aviator Harry Bingham Brown to set what was then a world altitude record of 5,000 feet. "Aviation was a lot more fun in the early days," she wrote years later. "You sat on a 6-inch strip of matchboard and held onto a wire strut and looked down past your toes at nothing but the earth." That was why Paterson came to speak of herself as a member of the airplane generation. By 1920, she had moved to Connecticut and was working for the sculptor Gutzon Borglum, who is best known today for carving Mount Rushmore. She stayed with Borglum for only 2 years, but cherished her time with the opinionated iconoclastic artist whose personality, like his work, was immense, bold, and vehemently American. Borglum had been recruited 5 years before to create a monument to the Confederate Army generals at Stone Mountain in Georgia, and a decade of tedious and bitter infighting with the Stone Mountain Memorial Association ensued. Sketches and models leaned up against one wall, Paterson remembered, and every while or two he would drop whatever he was doing and dash down to Washington to get a bill passed in favor of the memorial or to Atlanta to rally the Home Guard. At last, Borglum became so fed up with the political bickering and meddling with his work that he dramatically shattered the plaster miniatures of the sculpture and threw the pieces from the top of the mountain. A sheriff's posse chased him out of the state for destroying what the association claimed was its property, and the work was actually finished by a different sculptor. It was a characteristic gesture for Borglum, who was rumored to have also melted down the life-size figures of angels that he sculpted for a New York cathedral when church officials said they looked too feminine. That sound familiar to you? Paterson admired Borglum's defiance and his commitment to his artistic vision. Long afterwards, she would fondly recount stories of her time with him and lament the disappearance of that kind of bold masculinity. After her death, an acquaintance recalled that she often said she grew up in an age when men were men. Why she left Borglum's studio is not known, but in 1922 she embarked on a career at the New York Herald Tribune, which 2 years later gave her a weekly column called Turns with a Bookworm. She would write it every week for the next quarter century. This is a copy of Turns with a Bookworm from, September of 1943. They were always accompanied by these little pen drawings. Nobody knows who did the little drawings. But this drawing here is supposed to be Ayn Rand helping a friend across the street. According to Paterson said that Rand was terrified of crossing streets, and that when they would walk around Manhattan, she would grab her friend's hand and run across the street as fast as she could. And that's what that drawing is supposed to be. Turns with a Bookworm was not a book review column, although Paterson did write hundreds of book reviews and other items. Instead, it was a news, gossip, and opinion column about the publishing industry. And it contained everything from thoughts on new bestsellers to reports about upcoming events and answers to letters from readers. She had a wry sense of humor, often quoting poetry or comparing different authors' techniques. And she wrote in this clipped editorial style that gave one the sense of reading a news bulletin. Here's a sample from her July 7th, 1934 column. The best new book on the Virgin Queen is Milton Wadman's England's Elizabeth, but here is still another, J.E. Neal's Queen Elizabeth, which has solid merit. Yes, there is too such a place as Hum Tulips. We've been there. You might prefer Snoqualmie, Kitsum or Supsum. That column went on to discuss a new play by Edward Hope, a novel called You Can't Be Served, a box of chocolates a writer had sent to her, and her views on the gold standard. Paterson's extraordinary breadth of reading and friendship with leading intellectuals made her a brilliant raconteur, and her column became a must-read for the literary world. One writer said in 1937 that she probably has more to say than any other critic in New York today as to which book shall be popular and which shall be passed by. She could be brilliantly witty, but also unapproachable and even misanthropic. She was the goddess of common sense, wrote one colleague, who thought she contemplated the world with a mild impatience that people can make such a stupid mess of things. But others did not find her impatience mild. One writer said that she had a wit so searing that no rubber plant ever again grows in a room through which she has trod. Regularly described with words like acidulous, caustic, and waspish, she was sometimes ferociously stubborn, even when she was obviously wrong, a habit that worsened as she grew older. In 1929, the America that she had known began to transform. First, the Depression wiped out much of her savings. There had been depressions before, notably in 1893. But in those cases, the government had allowed buyers and sellers and investors and producers to negotiate new terms, which enabled markets to right themselves and grow stronger. But this time, the progressive president Herbert Hoover took a different route. Convinced that the cure for the Depression lay in keeping wages high, he implemented policies designed to reduce productivity and increase government spending. His administration paid farmers to keep produce off the market and urged cotton and wool producers to destroy their crops to prevent prices from falling. He approved severe restrictions on immigration and the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised the cost of imports and destroyed foreign markets for American farmers. He browbeat industries into keeping wages high, which meant companies spent much-needed capital, which hastened their bankruptcy. And he vastly expanded government building projects to keep people working. But because these were government jobs funded by taxes that were taken from the market, that was like scooping water out of one end of the swimming pool and pouring it back in at the other end. Hoover's belief that expert bureaucrats could manage the economy was shared by many intellectuals worldwide. The revolutions of Lenin and Mussolini were greeted by many as the dawn of a new era in which expert planners could organize production and trade to serve everybody's needs and eliminate inequality. Many thought individualism had been superseded by a new modern age of collectivism. In fact, as the 1930s began, the idea that America should become a dictatorship became frighteningly popular. On Inauguration Day in 1933, the new president, Franklin Roosevelt, told Americans that he had two priorities: to put people to work through direct recruiting by the government and to redistribute land to those best fitted to own it. And although he planned to recommend these proposals to Congress, he was also prepared, quote, in the event that Congress shall fail to take either of these two courses, to demand broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe, end quote. The Americans, he said, were looking for, quote, discipline and direction under leadership, and he would see sure that they got it. To anyone accustomed to the language of communism or fascism, these words were alarming. It seemed that there was much more to fear than fear itself. But as I've said, intellectuals had largely come to embrace authoritarian politics. Only weeks before Roosevelt's speech, Barron's magazine published an editorial advocating, quote, a mild species of dictatorship. Columnist Walter Lippmann advised Roosevelt in his column, "You have no alternative but to assume dictatorial powers." In May, a New York Times reporter proclaimed that Americans had given Roosevelt, quote, the authority of a dictator as a free gift, a sort of unanimous power of attorney. America today literally asks for orders, end quote. Paterson did not think Americans wanted orders or a planned economy or any of the transformations proposed by Roosevelt's brains trust. What everyone yearns for, she wrote a day after the inauguration, is to return to private property, to get out from under the heavy load of taxes and too much government. But Roosevelt had little respect for the Constitution or individual liberty. Among his first acts was to end the gold standard and declare that the government would no longer honor contracts that required it to pay people in gold. These so-called gold clauses were a protection against inflation because they provided that if the government engaged in inflationary policies, people could demand payment in gold instead of cash. By refusing to honor these promises, Roosevelt ensured that the dollar would be worth whatever he said it was worth. Paterson was indignant. She began devoting her columns to bitter and brilliant lectures about the meaning of money. Currency, she explained, is not a mere social construct. It's a tangible representation of production. For government to manufacture money by fiat, to essentially engage in counterfeit, is a form of theft because it diminishes the value of the dollars that are held by the people who earned them. And that cheating, she said, was the prime object of inflation. Roosevelt's policies were intended to operate as a hidden tax, which would, as she put it, wipe out the savings of the smallish people who have the deplorable habit of paying their debts in order to transfer their wealth to the government. When Walter Lippmann wrote that debates about inflation and the gold standard gave him a headache, Paterson shot back that if he found monetary policy hard to understand, he should go home and take an aspirin. Ridiculing the idea that the administration's gold measures were a form of theft, Lippmann argued that gold, like an umbrella, is the property of the man who holds it. No, Paterson replied. All the gold in the U.S. Treasury belonged to whoever had gold certificates. And by nullifying those certificates, Roosevelt was forcing people to accept a risk of inflation that they had tried to avoid. Gold was indeed like an umbrella in that the owners were keeping it for a rainy day, and it was stolen, seized by main force. In the years that followed, Roosevelt imposed federal control on virtually every aspect of the nation's economy. And Paterson became one of the most eloquent and insightful of the few media figures who opposed the New Deal. Government economic planning was foolish arrogance, she thought, because planners would have to know absolutely all of the factors of present and past out of which the future must proceed and anticipate inerrantly all of the possible new discoveries which may be made. Without such omniscience, their efforts to organize society would only put it in a straitjacket and encourage cronyism by using government power to serve private ends. Government and business can be entwined only in the same way as Laocoon and the Python, she wrote. It doesn't do either of them any good, and it's very hard to disentangle them again. Paterson thought that Roosevelt's advisors were a bunch of young men who went to college on an allowance and then came out with nice white collars to jobs on politely radical magazines supported by kind, wealthy ladies, whose political idea was a mother's boy economic program with a kind of maternal government taking care of everybody out of an inexhaustible income drawn from mysterious sources. Absolutely. And she thought the New Deal's basic fallacy lay in ignoring the role that individual personality traits play in generating productivity. Roosevelt's brain trust never asked themselves how wealth comes to exist in the first place, she wrote. They just take it as a fact of nature and go about redistributing it. Paterson thought wealth creators, whom she called self-starters, practice a specific set of virtues: thrift, industry, diligence, foresight, independence. Self-starters were the people who managed to plow and sow and reap, to build and make against the tempest, although all bureaucrats stand massed against them. Critiquing a book by a socialist in December 1933, Paterson objected that the author, quote, assumes as his setup a self-existent economy of plenty. There is no such thing. That potential plenty depends entirely upon a minority being allowed to function. We do not mean a class, but a certain type of mind. It exists in various degrees and forms: businessmen and farmers and foremen and housewives, the people who will always somehow get things done. They are self-starters, and their particular function is to hold everything together. One can't always see how they do it. A business may be so admirably organized that it looks as if it would run itself. But if you take out one or two men who keep it running and put in some bureaucrat who knows all the graphs and charts, the business will go to pieces. And in an effort to regulate everything, those people may easily be eliminated. They have been very nearly exterminated in Russia, end quote. While she was writing these columns, Paterson was also working on her novels. Never Ask the End was published in 1933, and The Golden Vanity a year later. Never Ask the End, which became a bestseller, was an introspective, naturalistic novel with almost no plot, but which was centered around the life and thoughts of a character named Marta, a stand-in for Paterson herself, who feels her youth vanishing under the onslaught of modernity and bureaucracy. Marta frequently contrasts the present day with the America she knew when she was young. We've come so far, she thinks, starting out in a prairie schooner and covering the last lap by airplane, to experience all the stages of civilization in one lifetime, from the nomad to the machine age. Yet now that vibrant sense of opportunity seems to have vanished under the bureaucratic mandates of the New Deal. And that theme of lost innocence was a frequent subject of Paterson's writing. In The Golden Vanity, which is her novel about the Great Depression, one character named Maisie, again a stand-in for Paterson, visits Washington State to see the place where she grew up, and she's mortified to see that her neighborhood has been demolished. She was gazing at an open square of naked and infertile sand with not a stick or a stone or a blade of herbage on its arid surface, eagerly built over with new, bleak, small buildings. Whoever was responsible, I hope they're dead broke, she thought. That's what the planners are going to do to us everywhere. In one of her columns, Paterson wrote that the Wright brothers were lucky to have lived before the New Deal because otherwise they would never have invented the airplane. They would have been forced instead to, quote, join a cooperative social group to study leadership, end quote, and fill out reams of paperwork. The airplane was invented in the United States, she said, precisely because this was the only country on earth, the only country that ever existed, in which people had a right to be let alone and mind their own business. New Dealers should ask themselves what would happen if the innovators and the inventors, whom Paterson called the intelligence section of society, were put out of, quote, put out of action by a system of economic controls, rationing, political restriction, and a devouring plague of bureaucrats throughout the world? That was not an idle question. In 1937, the economy fell into a second collapse, in some ways worse than the 1929 crash. It was caused by Roosevelt's massive new taxes on businesses, such as Social Security, and his new pro-union legislation, such as the National Labor Relations Act. Wages fell by 35%, and 4 million people lost their jobs. Refusing to admit that his programs had failed, Roosevelt instead blamed this depression within a depression on what he called the strike of capital. He claimed it was, quote, the result of a concentrated effort by big business and concentrated wealth to drive the market down just to create a situation unfavorable to me. And he ordered the FBI to begin investigating bankers and business leaders. Attorney General Robert Jackson told an audience that business owners were trying to liquidate the New Deal and establish a new manifestation of aristocratic anarchy by refusing to invest or hire. 4 days later, Interior Secretary Harold Ickes gave a radio address claiming that the nation's 60 richest families were engaged in a general sit-down strike, not of labor but of capital, end quote. In truth, there was no such conspiracy. Business owners and investors were simply reacting to the administration's policies, which penalized growth and seized earnings. But Roosevelt's scapegoating sounded all too familiar. After all, both leaders in Russia and in Germany were also blaming their own economic catastrophes on saboteurs and secretive counter-revolutionary forces. The following May, Paterson pointed out why the whole idea of a capital strike was fallacious. If there are sound opportunities which the banks pettishly refuse to take advantage of, she wrote, will the capital strike theorists name even one? Some person or firm who has, without reason, been refused a loan or for proper or profitable use? The recession was not a conspiracy. It was caused by the fact that any form of investment may be clubbed over the head by arbitrary rate fixing or property seizures or punitive investigations or taxes piled upon taxes. A month later, the former New Dealer Hugh Johnson, who had left the White House and become a Roosevelt critic, revealed that after the Supreme Court struck down some parts of the New Deal in 1936, Roosevelt had said to him, quote, business has bucked me, and when business wants to play with me again, it will be on its hands and knees. Paterson was astounded that nobody seemed outraged by this grave and repulsive language. Industry on its hands and knees is not a pretty idea, she wrote. What can be the state of mind which should anticipate that as a condition to play with? But instead of speaking up in their own defense, acquiescent businessmen chose to remain silent. If they don't resent such treatment, she said, they may come near deserving it. It was in this environment that Franklin Roosevelt decided to run for a third term. His decision did not surprise Paterson. She had predicted 4 years before that he would be the permanent nominee of the Democratic Party. There was little hope that Republicans could unseat him because so much employment now depended on his funding and favoritism that it was essentially buying votes with taxpayer money. But Republicans made a surprise decision in 1940 by nominating a virtual unknown, a businessman named Wendell Willkie, to run against him. Willkie happened to be known to Paterson. In fact, he was carrying on an extramarital affair with her boss at the Herald Tribune, Irita Van Doren. Willkie even attended some of Paterson's private parties at the Herald Tribune offices and published book reviews in the Herald Tribune. One of the many Americans who volunteered for Willkie's campaign was a Russian immigrant and author named Ayn Rand. After escaping the Soviet Union, she had published a novel and written a successful Broadway play. Now she was at work on a new book about a brilliant young architect. But convinced that Roosevelt's campaign for a third term meant it was now or never for capitalism, she laid aside her manuscript to work on Willkie's campaign. She was quickly disappointed by his lack of intellectual coherence. He had seemed like a principled defender of individualism and freedom, but once on the campaign trail, he descended into a weak Me Too style that left voters unenthusiastic. We received letters by the thousands begging us for information, she said, but the campaign had no intellectual ammunition to offer, and Willkie was easily defeated. That experience persuaded Rand that America needed a strong intellectual voice for individualism. She began trying to organize a group of thinkers to take up that work, and among those she invited to join was Isabel Paterson. Paterson said no. She never joined groups. But she invited Rand to visit her at the Herald Tribune offices, and it was there, probably in the spring of 1941, that the two met. They hit it off right away. Rand was awed by Paterson's historical and literary knowledge, and Paterson was fascinated by Rand's intellectualism and her personal experiences. They began meeting weekly at the Herald Tribune offices, which Rand loved. When Pat is in a good mood, she's like quicksand, she said, completely irresistible. Paterson invited Rand to visit her Connecticut home, and soon the young writer was a regular guest, joining Paterson for weekends during which they stayed up late discussing literature and history and philosophy. And other times, Paterson would spend the evening at Rand's Manhattan apartment, talking until sunrise about philosophy or joking about books and politics. Rand particularly treasured the memory of one late-night conversation about consciousness, during which the two tried to figure out what goes on inside the mind of a beaver. In fact, Rand worked a reference to this conversation into The Fountainhead. In one passage, the newspaper magnate Gale Winand recalls how when he was young and poor, he would sometimes escape his unhappy surroundings by thinking about his pet kitten, who was, quote, clean in the absolute sense, because it had no capacity to conceive of the world's ugliness. I can't tell you what relief there was in trying to imagine the state of consciousness inside that little brain, trying to share it, a living consciousness, but clean and free, end quote. In fact, the friendship between Winand and Howard Rourke owes much to the feelings that developed between Paterson and Rand. Around this time, Paterson, who took to calling Rand her sister, inscribed a copy of her novel If It Proved Fair Weather to Rand with a touching quotation from the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, because he was himself, because I was myself. It's a line that Montaigne uses to describe his relationship with Etienne de la Boétie, which Montaigne called the ideal companionship, one in which souls are mingled and confounded in so universal a blending that they efface the seam which joins them together. Rand reciprocated with a copy of The Fountainhead, in which she wrote, "You have been the one encounter in my life that can never be repeated," a line that in the novel is spoken by Winand to Rourke as an expression of the deepest possible rapport. Of all the aspects of Rand's philosophy of objectivism, the element that would prove most controversial was her rejection of the morality of sacrifice. Rand viewed herself as challenging the cultural tradition of 2,500 years. But Paterson shared Rand's ethical philosophy. A morality of rational self-interest, Paterson thought, is proper for human beings who are inherently individuals responsible for their own lives. It's also the only sound basis for political freedom. Quote, sacrifice and unselfishness seem to be the motives causing wholesale destruction devoted to death. When men relapse into selfish and unsacrificial motives, they create a living world, grow food, build houses, invent and construct and produce strictly for themselves. That's Paterson. Freedom must mean freedom for each person to pursue his or her own life for its own sake, an inherently self-interested proposition. After all, Paterson continued, wasn't it selfish for the slaves to want to be free? Why weren't they satisfied to live for their masters and die for them too? The masters said that it was for the good of society that they kept slaves, and their argument was quite as sound as any other argument for the good of society. Modern intellectuals, she thought, were drawn to altruism because it calls for the antecedent need or misery of its objects, and therefore gives politicians grounds to demand power over others. Thus, in her 1943 book, The God of the Machine, Paterson would condemn what she called the purest altruism of the communal cult, because it stood opposed to the principle that every person is born with the right to a life of his own, end quote. The God of the Machine was a breakthrough, not only because it drew a connection between the morality of self-sacrifice and the politics of collectivism, but also because it offered an explanation of economics in terms of the transfer of energy. Its general thesis is that economic exchange is a kind of circuit whereby individuals acting on their own local knowledge and circumstances can cooperate to exchange and create wealth while respecting each person's freedom to run their own lives. This distinguishes it from centralized command and control economies where everyone is forced to pursue a single unified goal and to occupy social positions that the authorities determine. Paterson focused not just on economics, but also on politics and ethics. In a passage strikingly reminiscent of the Fountainhead, Paterson distinguished between two different conceptions of power: power directed to the mastery of nature and power over other men. The latter is the essential characteristic of collectivism and is most easily disguised under humanitarian or philanthropic motives, end quote. Such a focus on power over people leads to a society that's frozen and changeless, as opposed to the fluid, ever-evolving society of freedom that's created by a culture that focuses on mastering nature. Static societies cannot innovate or invent because creative processes do not function to order, she wrote. To live, people must think, and to think, they must be free. And that explains why collectivist countries, such as the Soviet Union, stagnate or are forced to borrow or steal technology from freer societies. Rand called The God of the Machine, quote, the greatest defense of capitalism I have ever read, end quote. It, quote, could literally save the world if enough people knew of it and read it. That's high praise coming from Ayn Rand. But she and Paterson did not agree on everything. They differed about religion. Paterson thought that there has to be some non-physical essence in the human spirit to explain free will. And they differed in their literary views. As a practitioner of Romanticism, Rand did not admire the plotless stream of consciousness quality of Paterson's novels. And Paterson, by contrast, she respected the Romantic tradition, but was committed to naturalism. In fact, there is little evidence in Rand's fiction of any debt to Paterson, with three exceptions. First, Rand originally intended for Howard Roark to mention Hitler and Stalin in his climactic courtroom speech, but when Paterson saw the outline, she urged Rand to remove these references because they would date the novel and reduce its impact to future generations. It was good advice, and Rand followed it. Second, when Rand was working on Atlas Shrugged, Paterson urged her to omit unnecessary descriptive passages that slowed down the prose. I have been engaged in a wild orgy of weeding, Rand wrote back, not of devil's grass, but of adjectives. Now, it's unlikely that Rand had never heard this age-old writing advice before, but it was probably a helpful reminder. And the third was The Legend of Atlantis. Shortly after the Fountainhead film rights were sold, Rand moved to California to begin work on the movie. That took a lot longer than expected because World War II rationing slowed down film production. In the meantime, Rand worked on other films, including Love Letters. Why is that not working? There we go. Including Love Letters, which was released in 1945. Rand worked a sly reference to Paterson into the script. In one scene, a character holds up a toy boat that he played with as a child and says that it's named The Golden Vanity, the title of Paterson's 1934 novel. By then, Rand had already started work on Atlas Shrugged. She and Paterson had discussed the idea of this novel during their conversation together years before. And in October 1943, 5 months after The Fountainhead was published, Paterson wrote Rand a letter, enclosing a quotation. This, by the way, this is how Paterson's letters all look. They're riddled with incomprehensible typographical errors. They're never dated. Sometimes she would draw a line to tell you that this paragraph should be down there. I mean, they're very hard to read. But she included this quotation from the philosopher Averroes, who had urged his philosophers not to bother debating mystics who claimed that the truth was revealed to them by God. Reasonable people, said Averroes, should stay silent and simply content themselves with a solitary possession of rational truth. Didn't that attitude of intellectual retreat, Paterson asked, explain how the Muslim world had lost its position as the world's intellectual leader in the 12th century? Intellectuals like Averroes had withdrawn from the world and civilization had collapsed. Rand enjoyed the quotation and she wrote back, I know now that I will have to write Atlas Shrugged. You'll push me into it. In August 1946, Paterson reported in her column that Rand was working on a new novel that would provoke a lot of controversy when it appeared. But she warned readers to be patient because it won't be ready for a year or so yet. Of course, it ended up taking more than a decade. Rand would sometimes write to Paterson about her progress. In February 1948, she traveled from New York to Chicago to research railroads and steel mills and wrote Paterson a long, enthusiastic letter about her trip. She had even been allowed to operate the locomotive itself. She was by then far enough into the manuscript that she was sharing it with Paterson, and Paterson offered some suggestions on what became Chapter 8 of Part 1. In this part of the story, Dagny Taggart is accompanying Hank Rearden on the train ride over the bridge made of Rearden metal. Reading Rand's description of the character's sensations on the train sparked Paterson's joyful memories of riding railroads in the West in her youth. Quote, "A train streaming across the landscape was not quite like any other visual impression of things in motion," she told Rand. "It was not exactly a feeling of speed in the obvious way, as with a bird flying or a stone thrown or a creature running. Not exactly that it's going fast, but that it cuts space. It gets there so positively that the relative quality of speed becomes unnoticeable. It's on another scale, almost like planetary motion." Rand wrote back to say that she loved Paterson's way of putting it, and the final version of this passage captures a little of what Paterson was trying to say. Quote, "Dagny felt no wheels under the floor. The motion was a smooth flight on a sustained impulse, as if the engine hung above the rails riding a current. She felt no speed. She had barely grasped the sparkle of a lake ahead, and in the next instant she was beside it and then past. It was a strange foreshortening between sight and touch, she thought, between wish and fulfillment." Paterson also passed along helpful tidbits about for the novel. In 1943, she sent Paterson an advance reviewer's copy of Bootstraps, memoir by Tom Girdler, the president of Republic Steel Corporation. Now, 5 years before, Girdler had refused to organize with the militantly left-wing Steel Workers Organizing Committee, leading to violent protests at Republic Steel's plants, which left 10 people dead. Rand admired Girdler for his refusal to cave into the union's demands, and she based the character of Hank Rearden largely on Girdler. Part of the reason was Girdler's philosophical naivete. She and Paterson found his memoir disappointing because he failed to understand that the reason that he was demonized was not economic, but moral. Paterson wrote in her column that this book's most remarkable feature was the contrast between Girdler's enormous practical ability and his, quote, utter absence of general ideas, end quote. Girdler complained that, quote, "the rotten core in all the New Deal thinking was the presumption that a man with payroll responsibilities is necessarily less of a humanitarian than people of prominence without such responsibility," end quote. "That is not true," Rand told Girdler in a long and patient letter that she wrote him. "The real reason socialism was growing in popularity was because we accepted altruism as an ideal. That allowed self-professed humanitarians to claim a moral high ground they did not deserve. In principle and fact," Rand wrote, "socialists are parasites because they are primarily concerned with distribution." This is a quote. "Primarily concerned with distribution, not with production. That is, with distributing what they have not produced. Parasites are neither honorable nor kindly. So it shocked me to read you, a great industrialist, saying in self-justification that you are just as good as a social worker. You are not. You are much better," end quote. She closed that letter by urging him to read The Fountainhead and The God of the Machine. But the most significant of Paterson's contributions to Atlas Shrugged was the Atlantis metaphor. Paterson had been fascinated all her life by this ancient myth, and she invoked it frequently in her column. "In spite of myself, I have always believed in lost Atlantis," she wrote in one. She speculated that maybe the myth had its origins in some prehistoric discovery of North America, that there really had been an island of Atlantis and that it was the New World. Even if that was not literally true, Atlantis symbolized for Paterson the America she had known before the Depression. A land of possibility in which bold men were free to accomplish great things. Commenting on a book about the history of the American West, which she had personally known, she called it "a strange sunken world, a real lost Atlantis," which is the element of the American mind that Europeans do not understand. And in Never Ask the End, she wrote, "Marta could remember reading of the Wrights' first flight, so she could remember before that. It left one gasping to think of belonging to both ages. As a child, she thought about how the American West was a wild land that had never been plowed or fenced. One used to come to the end of a board sidewalk and step off upon virgin sod. But now Marta thinks that the people of her generation belong to a lost continent, a lost Atlantis, submerged under the westward tide of the peoples of the world. After us, nobody will know what it was like." Simply put, Atlantis represented the world that the airplane generation had grown up in, a pre-war, pre-depression, pre-New Deal economy full of boundless possibilities and brilliant innovators. In Atlas Shrugged, the world's great industrialists disappear into a refuge they call Galt's Gulch, but which they also call Atlantis. Spoiler alert. Atlantis, says John Galt, quote, exists not in the past of the human race, but in the past of every man, somewhere in the starting years of your childhood, before you learned to submit. The independence of rational consciousness facing an open universe, that is the paradise, end quote. The Atlantis myth that Rand and Paterson had discussed in their late-night conversations became, in Rand's metaphor, a spiritual place of possibility and opportunity and freedom, and devotion to one's highest values, a place like the American West of legend. It might seem ironic that Ayn Rand, who always considered New York City her spiritual home, would invoke the spirit of the West as the salvation of American liberty. But she did, in large part thanks to her Western friend, Isabel Paterson. But Paterson's own book, The God of the Machine, did not sell very well, and by 1948, her violent temper was getting out of hand. Rand once told a friend that she never approved of Pat's incredibly offensive manner toward people, but she couldn't figure out how to react because she had so much admiration for Paterson's fierce intellectual honesty and her strict devotion to ideas. When the wealthy philanthropist Jasper Crane, whom they both hoped might finance a new magazine devoted to free market ideas, told Paterson that The God of the Machine was too hard for average readers, Paterson exploded in a letter that called Crane stupid and cowardly and likened herself to Newton and Euclid. Then she proudly forwarded a copy of the letter to Rand, who was startled by its ferocity. Another time, Paterson chewed out a businessman so savagely for failing to defend capitalism that he replied that he now understood how the Germans must have felt after being firebombed. That's nothing, Paterson told Rand. I'll give him Hiroshima yet. Paterson knew how off-putting she could be. Slowly but surely, I am fixing it so that I won't speak to anyone but you, she told Rand, and then if you won't speak to me, I'll be all set for peace and quiet. Rand mused in her journal about Paterson's rage, wondering why she alternated between uncontrollable fury and a clingy need for attention. It seemed as though Paterson had been wrecked by a fierce sense of injustice, she wrote, an indignation toward cruelty and irrationality which erupted into exaggerated pride and an insane arbitrariness, and a tendency to say, I am right because I'm right. This habit became so extreme that it was hurting those whom she likes. Rand wrote a letter to Rose Wilder Lane to ask if she had observed this same phenomenon. Among Rand's papers is a fragment of Lane's reply, detailing examples of Paterson's angry stubbornness. Yes, Lane said. She told Rand about a time when she got into an argument with Paterson about whether rose bushes could grow in the shade underneath trees. Paterson insisted they could not. The two women were at that moment sitting on Lane's patio beside a maple under which a rose bush had flourished for years. And when Lane pointed this out, Paterson still angrily maintained that it was impossible. It was, Lane told Rand, an irresistible force meeting the immovable rose bush under the tree. In May 1948, Paterson flew to visit Rand in Los Angeles in hopes of interesting California investors in her idea of starting a new free market magazine. The visit was disastrous. Paterson treated Rand's friends so rudely and that she offended businessmen who might have been able to fund the magazine. Then, toward the end of her visit, she told Rand that she had been offered the chance to review The Fountainhead when it was published 5 years before and said no. And as a result, the Herald Tribune published one of the few negative reviews that the book received, which would never have happened if Paterson had chosen to review it. Rand felt betrayed. After a tense ride to the airport, she bid Paterson goodbye, saying, I hope you'll be happier than you are. Although they remained cordial and continued to correspond over the years to come, their friendship was essentially over. Rand was 45 years old, an accomplished writer with a bestseller and a major film and a growing circle of admirers. She had no more obligation to make excuses for Paterson's behavior. But she could never betray her appreciation and admiration for her former teacher. So, just as she included herself as a Hitchcock-like cameo in Atlas Shrugged, so she included Paterson in the book as the character who first speaks of Atlantis and then stubbornly insists it actually existed and then angrily storms away. Despite the end of their friendship, Paterson was thrilled by Atlas Shrugged when it was published. It was far more complex than War and Peace, she told a friend, cram-jammed with action. She was delighted by its defense of capitalism. The great fraternity of eggheads and deadheads and liberals and commies and bureaucrats are carrying on a deliberate campaign to kill the book if they can, she said. Indeed, reviewers were uniformly hostile, denouncing its unwavering individualism. Left-wing reviewers hated it, and conservatives were also outraged. National Review, of course, claimed that Rand wanted to murder her ideological opponents. Paterson, who had written for National Review, was furious and complained to William F. Buckley, calling the article libel, but Buckley ignored her. That, combined with Buckley's refusal to publish an article of her own in which she attacked businessmen for not defending capitalism, led her to sever ties with National Review. She spent the rest of her life on a modest pension, seeking a publisher for her last novel, and died in January 1961, and was buried in an unmarked grave in New Jersey, which is still unmarked, by the way. Even Buckley, who found her intolerably impolite and impossibly arrogant, had to admit in his obituary for her that she was a great woman. Paterson's biographer, Stephen Cox, says that she provided an intellectual link between a frustrated and alienated older generation of anti-collectivist Americans and an aggressive and optimistic younger generation. Certainly as a member of the airplane generation, of the vanished America of opportunity created by 19th century capitalism, which she thought of as the vanished island of Atlantis, Paterson considered herself the last survivor of a golden age. But she helped to bequeath to us a vision of that freer world, and not just a vision, but something much more precious, a rational intellectual argument for it. It would be nice to think that she was not the last of Atlantis' inhabitants, but the first of their return. Thank you very much. Looks like we have only 10 minutes for questions, so let's keep them fast.
Hi, how come Paterson didn't want to review The Fountainhead if she was her friend?
We don't know why Paterson chose not to review The Fountainhead. One charitable interpretation would be that maybe she thought it was a conflict of interest. Maybe she thought that because she had worked with Rand on writing the book that she shouldn't review it, but we really don't know whether it was that or anything else.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, where did you get the information about the conversation between Rand and Paterson about a beaver's consciousness, and if you could give some more details about that?
There's a book called 100 Voices, which is a collection of oral histories by people who knew Rand in one fashion or another, and that story comes from that, and is confirmed by a reference to the conversation in one of Paterson's letters to Rand. Paterson's papers are at the Hoover Presidential Library, and they have her letters to Rand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your amazing scholarship and outstanding presentation.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you, having studied both Rand and Paterson for this amazing presentation, for us, young intellectuals who are interested in being as, ferocious defenders of capitalism as Paterson and Rand were, can you offer any suggestions and what would you advise, for reaching their level of intellectual and written, capacity to defend these principles?
So two things: how to reach their level of intellectual understanding of freedom. Paterson's case, it was read. That woman read everything, and so that's one thing. Is she was constantly at work doing it. But the lessons, I think. I would be hesitant to say that we should learn too many lessons from the way they sought to defend freedom in the 1940s and so forth, because the culture has changed a lot. And there are lessons that we can learn from them, but the kind of angry denunciation that Paterson engaged in, even at the time, Rand thought it was counterproductive. Rand thought there needed to be good philosophical, rational arguments for freedom, and they needed to be presented in a comprehensible way. But angry diatribes, they turn off people sometimes. And, we all engage in it. That's fine. Everybody does that sometimes. And sometimes it's a very powerful rhetorical weapon. But you can go overboard. And Paterson definitely did.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I remember reading a few months ago that Paterson's use of imaging as theoretical language was something that Rand was very critical of. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on the differences between the philosophies of Rand and Paterson.
That there are ideas of imagery, you say?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I read. If you can elaborate on various differences.
So let me put it let me just give you a couple scattershot notes. First is, in their novels, they had a very different approach to their novels. Rand was very plot conscious. She wanted the plot to be integrated with the theme so that it would come out as a single, the final work come out as a single solid entity. And Paterson was much more interested in the writings of people like Virginia Woolf and modernist writing, and it has a very stream of consciousness quality. But she was not writing her fiction for political or philosophical reasons, and we don't have a lot of their conversations about literature, except that Paterson wrote a letter to a friend after their breakup. Paterson wrote a letter to a friend about a conversation with Rand in which Rand kind of tried to persuade Paterson to write in her style. And Paterson says to her friend that paraphrasing, she says the difference is that Rand is a genius and I'm not. And as far as their philosophies being different, the key difference between their philosophies really is that Paterson she could not grasp how you could have free will and an atheistic, mechanistic worldview. And although she did not consider herself a Christian or even particularly religious, she couldn't get that idea. Rand's view was, and it doesn't really matter that much what the origin of free will is. What matters is that man has free will. And so there's a very famous story about a mathematician, Pierre Laplace, I think, who was doing a presentation before Napoleon. And Napoleon asked him why he didn't include God in his equations. And Laplace said, "Sire, I have no need for that hypothesis." And that was kind of Rand's view about God, at least in her correspondence with Paterson. But she was really hated to talk about religion with Paterson because she didn't want to cause conflict. And that was not the source of their breakup, but it was a tension between the two.
Do you think that small but crucial distinction is why Paterson's name is almost seldom heard of?
No, the reason why is largely because Paterson is harder to read. The God of the Machine is not an easy book, and there are some things I would say, one of the great amazing things about the book is she anticipates the writings of the Austrian economists. She did not read the Austrian economists. By the time she first read Hayek, it was a year after God of the Machine was published, and she never read Mises she did read Omnipotent Government, but that was also after God of the Machine. So we don't have any evidence that she was influenced by the Austrians, and yet she anticipates a lot of their ideas, which is amazing. The downside is that Paterson would have been better off using a metaphor. Well, Paterson was very insistent that the God of the Machine was not a metaphor. She was not likening the economy to a machine. She was saying the economy is a machine, literally speaking, which caused Rand some trouble. If you read Rand's review of the book, she says, it's clear that Paterson does not mean this as a metaphor, but she doesn't actually explain really well how the economy is truly a machine. And I think the reason for that, and I think the Austrians would agree with this, is that Paterson would have been better off describing the economy as a biological entity, as something like a grown environment, as opposed to a mechanistic or electronic device. Carrie Ann.
Thank you.
I believe you said that Paterson saw America as Atlantis before the Depression and New Deal, but I'm curious whether she ever had any commentary on Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. involvement in World War I as being on the path towards statism.
Yes, so Paterson said that she had a nervous break, or came near to having a nervous breakdown when World War I happened. And Paterson thought that the true definitive act of a tyrant was the military draft. And of course, World War I was really the nation's first major use of the military draft. And Paterson wrote several columns denouncing the military draft in 1940, which was a remarkably brave thing for her to do, because under the Smith Act, the Sedition Act of 1940, it was a federal crime to criticize the military draft. And so she did that. Anyway, this is really remarkable. As far as Wilson, yeah, of course, she was very anti-Wilson and anti-progressive and so forth. So yeah, she was a good old-fashioned free marketer. Yes.
You mentioned her experience with a light bulb at the impressionable age of 16. Do you think that, and I remember reading that she had talked about Edison. Do you think that her experience with electricity growing up, if that influenced her energy and machine metaphor, and also about any other influences?
Totally did, absolutely. You can imagine. Now, if you've ever seen, what's the Some of you will know the title because I can't think of it, but there was a movie just recently about Edison and Tesla. The Current War. Have you seen The Current War? It's an imperfect movie. It has its flaws, but there's this amazing scene, which I swear will make you cry, where they go to the World's Fair and they see the light bulbs for the first time at night. And you can imagine what an earth-shattering experience this was for people. It truly transformed human life forever. And so there's a reason why in Anthem, Rand uses the light bulb as a metaphor for the reasoning faculty. And it's actually quite an ingenious metaphor. I mean, we all use it as in comic strips, right? The light bulb is the idea that a person has. And I suspect that Rand may have gotten some of that from Paterson, or at least it was reinforced by her. We can't really tease out their conversations exactly, so there's some guesswork there. Like, I can't prove that Rand got the idea of blowing up Cortland from Gutzon Borglum shattering his sculpture. I would love to find a smoking gun for that. I don't think she actually did. I think she got it from a wide variety of ideas. But Paterson certainly helped reinforce Rand's views on these sorts of things.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question.
Are there any other cameos in Atlas Shrugged, specifically Nathaniel Branden or Frank O'Connor?
I don't know. There are, in my forthcoming book, I go through a number of cameos in The Fountainhead. Of course, everybody thinks that Howard Roark is loosely based on Frank Lloyd Wright, and he is loosely. But actually, probably Frank Lloyd Wright Howard Roark is least like his real-life basis, Howard Roark, than any other character in the novel. Austin Heller is based on H.L. Mencken. I suspect, but can't prove, that Stephen Mallory is based on Sinclair Lewis, and there are other, and of course Gail Wyman is very much based on William Randolph Hearst. But Howard Roark is only very loosely based on Frank Lloyd Wright. But in Atlas Shrugged, this one thing I'd like to leave with you all: people read Atlas Shrugged, they often say, "Oh, what a prophetic novel! Here's Rand talking about what might happen in the future." Atlas Shrugged is Rand's depression novel. It's her novel about the Great Depression. Virtually everything that happens in the novel actually did happen during the Great Depression. And that history, you talk about erased history, our woke friends like to talk about history being erased, that is the history that has been erased. The history that has been erased is the oppression of the American people by New Deal bureaucrats for a dozen years under the thumb of Franklin Roosevelt. And it's been whitewashed by historians who are so committed to the preservation of the regulatory welfare state. It's truly disgraceful. If there are any history grad students out there who are looking for a project, I mean, God bless you. As he says in The Fountainhead, you're marching into hell. But that's your PhD dissertation. We need a people's history of the New Deal to talk about what actually happened in this country during that time. Thank you very much.